All right. So now for something a little different. It's black. It's not white. So what I'd like to talk about today is sort of having St. Thomas give us really a word of encouragement. Because I would like to suggest is I think St. Thomas has noticed something about the way we learn that is universal. And so even though I'm going to start with a very specific example, much akin analogically, of course, to the way Maureen was sort of analogically pivoting off of mathematics, I'm going to start with an example that St. Thomas takes from his theological teaching. And as Sam rightly pointed out, it's clear St. Thomas is an exemplary teacher, and he pays attention to how his students are engaged. Some of my favorite sort of early depictions of classrooms, and they didn't really have classrooms in the early University of Paris, but some of my favorite pictures depict students doing all sorts of things that, sans computers, our students still do. So there's this very venerable Dominican lecturer, and there's all these students out there, and some of the students are sleeping, some of the students are talking to each other, some of the students are passing notes, and they're like, wow, it just doesn't necessarily change. So there's a classroom environment that's almost perennial and universal. And yet, I think that we ourselves as teachers, we share some common experiences, whether or not we're in theology or we're in math or we're in the sciences or we're in business or econ, etc. And that is that I think as we sort of made the transition from our doctoral studies into teaching or from our master's studies into teaching, we made early on a discovery that we cannot, as much as we might like to sometimes, we cannot, and this is my favorite quote, by the way, from Sam Condick, and he would always say this to me when I was an undergrad here in philosophy, and he would say, I can explain it to you, but I cannot understand it for you. And, sometimes Sam can come off a bit abrasive, but he was not being, in fact, mean-spirited. He was speaking something that actually is really important for us as teachers to come to terms with. We can't understand it for our students. Our students actually have to be the one that understands, and we are there to accompany, facilitate, yes, but I think St. Thomas actually invites us to consider that there's something that we're seeking to cultivate in our students. So one of the things that Sam identified about St. Thomas's sort of unique anthropology that sets him apart slightly from some of the other thinkers about teaching is that we have this innate power. What I'd like to add is a layer on top of that, is that St. Thomas recognizes that there are ways that we can perfect our intellectual powers of learning. And what I want to suggest is that one of those perfections or habits is in fact something that's almost like, not quite, but almost like a habit of discovery. All right, so now, St. Thomas the teacher in the classroom doing theological disputation in the 13th century. Okay. He says that there's really two different approaches that a theological master can take when he's dealing with disputation, when he's dealing with a disagreement, or when he's dealing with a kind of confrontation even. And the interesting thing that I noticed about how St. Thomas thinks about disputation or disagreement is not only that it illuminates two different ways that we teach, but it also illuminates, I think, two different kinds, not exhaustively, but two different kinds of dispositions that our students often have in the classroom. That is to say, sometimes our students have different kinds of questions. Sometimes our students approach things from a standpoint of doubt. And they can have doubts about many things. They can have doubts about us. They can have doubts about the material. They can have doubts about the textbook because they discovered a mistake on the first page and now they're not sure if really that's a reliable thing at all anymore. And they could also have doubts about, well, what do you expect? What do you expect from me on the exam? We definitely have those A-lister students that are like, I need to know what I need to know so that not only can I pass your class, but those glorious nursing students, I love them so much, they're like, I need to get an A in your class. And I need you to tell me what I need in order to get an A on your class because I have doubts about whether or not I'm going to get an A in your class or not, okay? So this is a real disposition in our students. And listen, we all have our various, again, kind, loving approaches to helping to bring some kind of assurance to our students, and we're trying to alleviate those doubts. But there's another attitude, right? And I'd like to suggest that it's the more mature attitude in our students, right? And that's not to say that we have students that are on scholarships, we have students that are dealing with 40-hour work weeks, they're balancing so much, family responsibilities, etc. So there is, I think, a really crucial time and place for us to remove doubts. But it seems that our role as teachers really is not just to remove our students' doubts, but to notice when the kind of questions that they have has pivoted. They aren't asking, what am I supposed to know? What do I have to know to get this or that? But instead, they've actually made a shift. They want to understand. The register of their questioning has changed in its very pattern, in its very texture. They've been taken in to the material, right? If you teach business and all of a sudden you realize that the philosophy major that hasn't really been paying all that close attention for about a third of the way through the semester suddenly goes, I've never thought about it like that. And they stay after and they ask you questions after class. Right? Or vice versa. I've had physics majors who in Q&As preparing for exams suddenly shifts from simply asking the questions that are the study guide to asking 3 and 4 and 5 follow-up questions because all of a sudden they've gotten a hold of something that they're actually really trying to understand, not because they're going to pass the test, but because they just want to understand it. That I think is a tremendous sign, and I think St. Thomas recognizes that, That's a different kind of question, and it requires a sort of different kind of interaction, but that in fact, it's the more mature interaction between teacher and student, that there's now this sort of elevated discourse. And although it might seem kind of weird and strange, I'd like to actually think about this phenomenon where the student begins now to think differently, begins to think, we might even say originally, we might even say thinks creatively. The great psychologist, 20th century psychologist, Erich Fromm, actually thinks about spontaneity, originality, and creativity as an exceedingly important dimension of development in human freedom. Okay? This new register, this new sort of stage in student learning actually has to do with cultivating a sense of agency and freedom in our students. Because, again, going something that I noticed that Sam said, students are not purely passive, right? Students are collaborators, and if they don't understand themselves as being part of the process of learning, then they're probably not going to be able to regularly make that transition into this different register of intellectual questions. The great physicist David Bohm notices, I think, something important about this phenomenon of originality, and that is that originality doesn't actually mean that your student discovers something, or even, turn it on ourselves, that we discover something that no one's ever discovered before. Okay? Now, that's pretty neat when it happens, especially, you're like writing, you're working on that article, and you're like, yes, 750 years, yes, I got it, right? But that's novelty. Originality, as sort of Baum thinks about it, is not that you've learned or discovered something that's totally new that no one's ever thought before, but that in fact, going back to that idea of freedom that I was on the previous slide with Fromm, that you've had your own thought, right? That your student or you has actually undergone this shift where the discovery originates in you or in your student. They've put things together. There's an order that emerges. They're able to integrate or even regulate similarity and difference into a pattern that now they can recognize again and again and again. The similarities that, for example, Maureen was talking about in all those different equations that I definitely understood neither the verbal formulation nor the visual formulation, but they looked really neat. I walked into a classroom the other day and there was clearly a whole bunch of really cool diagrams of DNA gene sequencing. And I knew that that's what it was, but I didn't know anything other than that. They just looked really cool diagrams on the PowerPoint that got left up. So this fountain, this spring, right, that comes up in the form of originality, David Baum calls creativity. And one of the great things I think and how is this related to St. Thomas? Well, the way I think it's linked to St. Thomas is that David Baum doesn't think that it's just for geniuses like Einstein, right? He actually thinks that creativity, originality, has its essence in human learning itself. That every moment of genuine learning is in fact a moment of originality and creativity. So before I turn back to this quasi-habit of discovery and kind of close things out, I just want to draw attention to a distinction that I think is really helpful, and it's not one that I made, but that in fact another great philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, makes, and that is he sort of draws our attention to the difference between conceiving of science or of any other kind of art or discipline simply as a body of knowledge, which certainly we can use the phrase that way. And instead he suggests, again, with this kind of language of creativity that we just saw in Baum and in Fromm, I didn't plan on those rhyming, but it does. Got to work that in better next time. He talks about science as an activity and as a creative activity. And going back to some of Sam's earlier observations, when we're trying to inculcate a field, when we're trying to share our disciplines with our students, we are not merely trying to make a data transfer, right? We're not trying to transfer all the accumulated knowledge of the past 100 or 200 or philosophy 2,500 years. We're not trying to download that into their minds. Instead, we're in fact trying to equip them with the skills, with the habits, with the methods that will enable them to do the thing that we do, to do math, or to do biology, or to do accounting, or, and I'm going to go to this after, I'm about to go to my theological methods class after this. Every week I'm trying to teach my theo majors, how do you do theology, right? I'm trying to inculcate an activity or an operation into them. And that actually suggests that what we're trying to do as teachers, as I think St. Thomas and actually Aristotle understood it as well, is just like in all areas of life where we encounter things that are hard, okay? New things are hard, okay? Daylight savings time happened last weekend. All of my children, disaster, just absolute emotional bedlam, bad. New time change, bad emotional juju, okay? Like, it's just not good. It's just absolute chaos, and it's wild. So children don't respond to new things very well. Sometimes adults don't respond to new things very well. Every time there's a new rollout for something, I think, Oh, I have to learn how to do it a different way. Okay? So listen, learning is hard. It isn't easy. But any hard thing that you continue to do regularly will eventually start to become easier. I believe that if I had Maureen as a calculus teacher, that eventually even I could learn calculus, and then I could spend more time reading the philosophers of physics that I really like, because I always have to skip the equation parts and just read the verbal parts. But Maureen could help me learn calculus, and not only would I get to learn it, I would not hate it. I would enjoy it. Right? So these habits, these things that Aristotle and St. Thomas calls intellectual virtues, one of the perfections of our intellect, St. Thomas, following Aristotle, calls, surprise, surprise, science. Okay. Science. Science is, in fact, a quasi-habit of discovery. Now, how so? Well, St. Thomas suggests that although you cannot force a discovery, although you cannot force an insight, however badly you want it, however much money some of our students might pay for it, okay, you can't make it happen. And in fact, as you saw on the previous slide, sometimes our insights, our greatest discoveries happen when we're least expecting it. I think some of my happiest moments have been in the shower. And I wasn't even thinking about a problem. It just sort of comes to me. And then I got to get out as fast as I can because I got to get it onto a notebook because otherwise I'm going to forget it. But other times it's because you're taking a walk. Other times it's because you're just talking with a friend. Other times it's because you're eating your favorite food. Discovery comes at unexpected times. And yet, all of us who have done extensive research, all of us that have poured our lives into certain kinds of investigations, something about investigation, something about research, I think shows us that when we want to know something, the longer that we've been researchers, the better we are at being able to find the thing that we want to know. And this, in St. Thomas's understanding, is, I think, precisely what the habit, as he understood it, which obviously a little bit different than now, but this habit, this scientific habit, is in fact something that you can cultivate through will. That is to say, this activity that he calls consideration is something that you can hone, that you can choose to do regularly, and that it can dispose you so that almost with a thought, you can make a discovery. Thanks.